I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jack Ruby so you can decide what you think his motives might have been. Well, Jack Ruby was born in 1911, and he was born in Chicago, Illinois, but he wasn't born Jack Ruby, and you might have picked this up in the films. He was born Jacob Rubenstein. Excuse me, he was one of 9 children. He grew up in a very tough Jewish and Italian neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. Both of his parents were born in Poland. They both immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s. Ruby's father was a very violent alcoholic, and his mother died in a mental hospital. So you can see that these guys really have had quite the lives. As a child, Ruby also was arrested for truancy, and he spent time at the Institute of Juvenile Research in Chicago. A little bit of parallel between the two. When released from the Institute, Ruby lived in a number of foster homes during the time he grew up, and he soon got the nickname Sparky because of his quick temper. After finishing the 5th grade, he dropped out of high school at the age of 16. That doesn't mean he was in school in the 5th grade when he was 16. That's the farthest he ever completed his education, was 5th grade. Never really got anything going after that, and finally dropped out of school at the age of 16. He got jobs running errands for the notorious Chicago mobster Al Capone. He was running errands for him as a young boy. He then spent time in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He eventually returned to Chicago in 1937. A friend of his by the name of Leon Cook arranged for him to work for the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union. Believe it or not, they have a union for that. On December 8th of 1939, his friend Leon Cook was shot dead by John Martin, who is the president of the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union. And as a result of the murder of his friend, Ruby left that job and found employment as a salesman selling plaques that were commemorating Pearl Harbor. He was drafted into the military in 1943 after Pearl Harbor and served in the Army Air Force during World War II. He attained the rank of Private First Class and was honorably discharged on February 21st, 1946. After his discharge, he returned to Chicago and found work selling small cedar chests for a company that was owned by his brother, Earl Ruby. In 1947, Ruby moved to Dallas, Texas to help his sister run a supper club in which Ruby was an investor. In December of 1947, Ruby and his brothers decided to change their names to help them become more successful because they were Jewish. There was discrimination going on among Jewish people, and Rubenstein was a pretty obvious Jewish name, and so he and his brothers all made the decision that they were going to shorten their name to Ruby so they would not be discriminated against and would have a chance to be more successful. In 1952, Ruby experienced some financial difficulties and lost 2 nightclubs he owned at the time. One was called the Silver Spur and one was called the Bob Wills Ranch House. Ruby then got himself back on his feet, and he operated 2 different clubs in Dallas, the Vegas Club and the Sovereign Club. The Vegas Club was actually owned by his sister, and Ruby changed the name of the Sovereign Club to the Carousel Club, which was located in the heart of downtown Dallas. Ruby went to great lengths to help out his dancers. Many stated he treated them like they were family. Probably the example of that is when he chose to wire the money in advance to Little Lynn, so to speak, when she needed money prior to going over to the Dallas County Police Department and shooting Oswald. Ruby's employees did say he had a very violent temper. He frequently got into physical altercations with people both in and out of work. They also stated that he cared about the people who worked for him, and he regularly rehired employees that he would lose his temper and fire them. And then he'd feel bad about it, then hire them back. Very, very quick-tempered man, very reactionary guy. He was friendly with mob-related people. He was friendly with professional gamblers, and he had a very, very good relationship with the Dallas Police Department. Many of the officers frequented his club, and most of the 1,200 Dallas police officers knew Ruby personally. As they said, he always treated them well, often giving them free dinners and free drinks because he appreciated the efforts that they were making. Ruby dealt on a cash basis only, carried his money in the trunk of his car, and always carried a gun, which he had a legal authority to do. He had poor credit and often seemed to be strapped for money. However, his net income at the time of his shooting Oswald was estimated at $14,000, which would be about $108,000 today. That's how much he was worth. After he assassinated after Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy, Ruby was very distraught. According to one of his strippers, Joyce Gordon, whose stage name was Joy Dale, that he was hysterical when he arrived back at the Carousel Club after learning of the president's assassination. When Dale got on a bus to go home that evening, she later testified that Ruby was getting his shoes shined. Tears were rolling down his cheeks as he petted his dog, Sheba. That was her statement to the Warren Commission. After Ruby shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, he was jailed at the Dallas County Jail less than a block from where the president was assassinated, which you know. And he was defended by a prominent San Francisco defense attorney by the name of Melvin Belli. Got a good defense attorney. Now, a guy named Joe Tonahill, who was an associate to Belli, suggested that Ruby plead guilty to the lesser charge of murder without malice. Does anybody know what that would mean? Murder without malice? Without intent, yeah, without, not intent. You know, if you murder with malice, you had a plan, you went in and murdered those people. I hate to even bring this up, but this shooting yesterday, where this guy, pulled the fire alarm to get him out, that's murder with malice, with an intent to kill. Tonahill tried to get Ruby to plead guilty to a lesser charge of murder without malice, that he didn't plan it, didn't do it intentionally. It was a spontaneous reaction, which I think it was. Now, if he would have pled guilty to the lesser charge of murder without malice, the maximum sentence would have been 5 years. Maximum, 3 to 5 years. Well, Melvin Belli, he was kind of a high, prominent San Francisco attorney, and he wanted nothing but a full acquittal for Ruby, and he counseled him to plead innocent by what? Reason of insanity. Well, unfortunately for Ruby, he chose to take Belli's advice. The strategy failed. On March 14, 1964, Ruby was found guilty of murder with malice and was sentenced to death. During the 6 months following the Kennedy assassination, Ruby repeatedly asked to speak to members of the Warren Commission, and we're going to explain that to you in a bit. Ruby hinted that he had secrets about the assassination that he could not disclose. Ruby's sister wrote letters to the Warren Commission, which became public, that put a lot of pressure on the Warren Commission to indeed travel to Dallas and talk to Ruby. So in June of 1964, 2 members of the Warren Commission visited Ruby in his jail cell. One was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, and the other one was Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford. We'll talk about that a little later. They asked him right away if he had any mob connections that affected the killing of Oswald, and Ruby swore to the 2 members of the commission he had no connections to the mafia in any way, shape, or form. Ruby then begged Chief Justice Warren several times to take him back to Washington, D.C. because he feared for his life and the life of his family. Okay, he said, you got to take me to D.C. and protect me because I'm afraid for not only myself but my family. Now, this is an interesting email I'm going to read to you. And this is an email I received many years ago from a guy by the name of Rob Ruby. And I got to find it here real quick. I can read it to you. Popped right out the last time I was looking for it. But Rob Ruby was Jack Ruby's nephew, so to speak, his brother's child. And I was on eBay many, many years ago, and I was looking for this book. And the guy that was selling it had the kind of code name on eBay of Rob Ruby, and I just kind of emailed him and said, are you related to Jack Ruby? And this is the email I got back on November 27th of 2000. Randy, thanks for your message. Yes, my dad Earl Ruby is Jack's brother. At the time I was 14-year-old high school 10th grader. I really did not know my uncle at all. I think I met him once when I was 10 or so. I can tell you that it was a crazy time for the nation, and especially for my family. We lived in the Detroit, Michigan area, and the press there was very interested in our connection to the tragedy in Dallas. We received bizarre phone calls, and my parents were worried about our safety. My sister and I were driven to school in police cars. Now, this guy was so far removed, but he had the name Ruby and was related to Jack Ruby. He says, if you have any other questions, let me know, and I'll pass them on to my dad. He has not yet hooked up to the computer age. So anyway, I did hook up with him, and that'll be part of this lecture in a minute. I had a little interview with his dad in 2000, and I'll tell you what he said. But anyway, it gives you an example that, you know, Ruby was concerned about the safety of his family, and it even affected those that were so far away. Okay, Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren refused Ruby's request, stated that the commission would have no way of protecting him because they had no police powers. He told Ruby he should not talk about the case publicly to protect himself. Well, following his conviction in 1964, Ruby got a new lawyer, a guy by the name of Sam Houston Clinton, and he appealed to the Texas Court of Appeals, which was the highest criminal court in Texas, and argued that Ruby could have never received a fair trial in the city of Dallas because of the excessive publicity that surrounded the case. And he had a good point, because in 1966, 3 years after Oswald's murder, the Texas Court of Appeals overturned Ruby's conviction and did order a new trial for him. That trial was going to be scheduled for February of 1967, and it was going to be moved to Wichita Falls, Texas. Unfortunately, at the time of his appeal, Ruby was 55 years old and seriously ill. On December 9th of 1966, he was admitted to Parkland Hospital. He was suffering from pneumonia and was later diagnosed with lung cancer. On January 3rd of 1967, he died of a pulmonary embolism, which is a blockage of the main artery in the lung. It's like a blood clot gets caught, kills you. He was buried beside his parents in the West Lawn Cemetery in Illinois. And this is what I like. This is kind of his walking legacy. He really wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be liked for what he did. But here's his legacy. Not that of a hero, but that of one who would forever obstruct justice, obscure truth, and spawn conspiracy. And that's just what he did. He obstructed justice, because we'll never find out what the situation was. He obscured truth, because we'll never know what Oswald's motives were. And he started what everybody believed was a conspiracy to kill the president because of his actions in killing the assassin of the president. Okay? Now, I did have this interview with Earl Ruby on December 4th of 2000. It was kind of an interesting discussion. He was 85 years old when I visited with him that day, and he was 4 years younger than Jack Ruby. Obviously, Jack Ruby had died, but as they grew up, he was 4 years younger. He defended his brother. He stated that Jack Ruby loved President Kennedy. He respected him very much. He told me that his brother would not allow comedians who performed at his club to make fun or talk down about the president or his family. He contended that Jack was not part of any conspiracy and acted completely alone in the killing of Oswald. He stated that it was his brother's intention. This is interesting. He said it was his brother's intention not to kill Oswald, but to wound him, because he would be seen as a hero. What would be his explanation? How could he justify that Oswald just wanted to wound him? What would be his justification for that? What? Yeah, he shot him in the stomach. I mean, if he was going to shoot, he was going to intended to kill him, according to Earl Ruby, he said he shot him in the stomach instead of the chest or heart area because he didn't want to kill him. He also told me, and I don't know if this is true, but he told me that the medical staff that was tending to Oswald were slow to get him to the doctor for treatment. And he also told me that Oswald was in the hallway for 40 minutes prior to seeing the doctor, which he thought resulted in his death. I don't think that's true, but that's what he told me. Okay? Jack Ruby was originally sentenced to die in the electric chair, but as I mentioned, it was Earl Ruby, though, that hired Sam Houston Clinton and the retrial being ordered. And Earl Ruby also told me the following in the interview. He said that his brother owed him $16,000 at the time of the Oswald shooting, and that he had paid over $100,000 for Jack Ruby's trial to get the initial trial and to get the trial redone. So anyway, that's the information I gave. He's since has passed on, so we don't have much opportunity to say much to him at this point. We've talked a lot about the Warren Commission. This is the last thing we'll talk about on this deal. And the Warren Commission was better known as the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. But that was a little bit lengthy, okay? And on November 29th of 1963, just 7 days after the President's assassination, new President Lyndon Johnson issued a presidential executive order. It was Executive Order 11130. And what it did is it created a special committee or commission to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and its aftermath. Now, when he put this committee together, it was Lyndon Johnson who hand-picked Chief Justice Earl Warren to chair the committee. He wanted him to do that, and because Chief Justice Warren chaired this important committee, it's often referred to as the Warren Commission rather than the President's Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, there were 7 members that were handpicked by President Johnson to serve on this committee. Most names won't be familiar, but some will. Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Second one's kind of interesting. Anybody remember who Allen Dulles was, a former CIA director? Anybody know what happened to Allen Dulles? He got fired after the Bay of Pigs affair, right? Well, he was on the Warren Commission. A Democratic congressman from Louisiana, Hale Boggs, was on the commission. A Republican senator from Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper, was on the commission. A Democratic senator from Georgia, Richard Russell, was on the commission. He was a very famous senator. Matter of fact, one of the Senate buildings, you have the Hart Senate building and you have the Russell Senate building, in which senators are housed now, that was named after him. Also had a fellow by the name of John McCloy, who was at one time served as the Assistant Secretary of War during World War II. But the name probably most familiar on that commission was Gerald R. Ford, who was a Republican at the time, congressman from Michigan, who turns out to be President of the United States. And he was on the Warren Commission. Now, the commission was established to investigate 3 things: the assassination of President Kennedy, the shooting of John Connally, and the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit. That's what it was set up to do. Now, kind of an interesting story is that prior to the executive order given by President Johnson, who had all the information, who had all the evidence in the JFK assassination? Dallas Police Department in Texas. Once this executive order came into place, the evidence was to be placed in the hands of who? FBI. Well, by Texas state law, that really wasn't legitimate, to be honest with you. They shouldn't do that. So Police Chief Jesse Curry folded a little bit, and he told J. Edgar Hoover, I'll let you have the rifle and the evidence for 24 hours, and then you have to return it. So there was even a little bit of a bending of the rules in that deal, and Curry let him have the information for 24 hours and studied it and sent it back. Well, the Warren Commission began their investigation on December 5th, 1963, and it ended on September 24th of 1964, about a 9-month investigation. They collected testimony from about 552 individuals. They accumulated over 3,000 pieces of evidence, and it was on September 24th of 1964 that the Warren Commission announced their findings. And their findings came out in a 26-volume set. Okay, so I always get a kick out of people who say, I don't believe the Warren Commission. Well, have you ever read it? It's 26 volumes. I have it in my office if you'd like to, go through it sometime. It's a lot of evidence. Everybody says they don't believe it, never read it. But anyway, the Warren Report, as it was referred to, here's what they concluded. Quote, on the basis of the evidence before the Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the assassination. There has been no conspiracy in the JFK assassination or in its results. Jack Ruby acted for himself in his killing of Oswald. That's their final statement. So, what do you find odd about that final statement, considering what they were supposed to investigate? Is there anything in there on John Connally or J.D. Tippit? No. The pressure kind of mounted, and everybody was much more interested in A, if there was a conspiracy to kill a president, and B, was there a conspiracy in the killing of Oswald? And so that's what they concentrated their efforts on. The American people believed the Warren Commission for a time, but because of Jack Ruby's actions and public signs of dissatisfaction, rumors and findings began to surface, and all of a sudden you had a bunch of conspiracy theories. And the biggest suspects in these conspiracy theories of killing President Kennedy became the Soviet Union and the Cuban government and the CIA. Our own CIA even killed him. Organized crime or the mafia did it, and it even got to the point where people were accusing Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Now, I don't remember who had the person that's filled out. Was that you, Olivia? Was it your grandfather? Who was that? Your uncle actually stated in his that he always thought Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination, which doesn't surprise me because that's kind of what came up. Conspiracy books started to come on the market. Probably the most famous 2 conspiracy books in the 1960s were Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane. It was a copyright of 1966, and it centered the assassination conspiracy around the CIA, that they were involved. and probably the most famous conspiracy theory books that's worth the most is 6 Seconds in Dallas by Josiah Thompson. That came out in 1967, and his take on it was the Cuban government was involved. So everybody had a conspiracy theory of who was involved. Because of the continued controversy and public pressure to know the truth, two important events happened concerning both the assassinations of President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald. First of all, the body of Lee, I'll start with that. The last thing that happened is the body of Lee Harvey Oswald was exhumed from the burial site in 1981 because there were rumors out there that he wasn't buried in that grave, that he was a patsy, they set him up, you know, that he actually got away and somebody else was buried in his gravesite. It got so bad that Marina actually let them exhume the body because she got tired of listening to it, and when they went in and checked the dental records, they found out that indeed it was Lee Harvey Oswald in that grave. But back in 1976, because of this continued controversy, they established a committee in the House of Representatives called the House of Representatives Assassination Committee, and they restudied the assassination from 1976 to 1979, and in 1979 this is what they released as their official verdict on the assassination. I'm not sure if any of you knew it was restudied again or not. I'll just kind of read this to you. It says, findings of the Select Committee on Assassinations in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963, state, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots at President John F. Kennedy. The second and third shots he fired struck the president. The third shot he fired killed the president. That's what they stated in 1979. So what would have happened to the first one? Had to have missed. Okay? There's a theory on that too, but whatever. Second part of that, it says President Kennedy was struck by 2 rifle shots fired from behind him. The shots that struck President Kennedy from behind him were fired from the 6th floor of the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository Building. Lee Harvey Oswald